Hello, viewers. Welcome to this latest podcast of the Nationalist View, and we have with us a very special guest, Dr. Sriparna Pathak. Dr. Pathak, thank you so much for being here. Uh,
It's always a pleasure to be, on your show, and I love the discussions with you. Thank you so much for having me again.
so, we're going to talk about basically the battle of narratives today and how the West and the Chinese. So, they are especially engaging with Indian intellectuals. And also, apart from that, through their think tanks, through their media outlets, how they are spreading the anti-India propaganda. But before that, let me give you a brief introduction of Dr. Pathak. Dr. Pathak is a professor of China Studies and the founding director of the Center for Northeast Asian Studies at prestigious OP Jindal Global University, which is in the Indian state of Haryana. And she also serves in the capacity of the associate director of the Jindal Institute, Jindal India Institute. Most importantly, she teaches courses on foreign policy of China as well as theories of international relations. She was awarded a doctorate degree from the Center for East Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University in 2015. Dr. Pathak is very, well versed in Mandarin Chinese. So there are very few experts in India who are so well versed in Mandarin Chinese. She has studied in China itself, and she is also fluent in English, Hindi, Bengali, and Assamese. Dr. Pathak, let's begin with the controversy around Christopher Clary's recent write-up for the Stimson South Asia Centre. This was regarding Operation Sindhu. And many intellectuals, including former Indian Foreign Secretary Kanwal Sibal, he called it factually misleading and biased in favor of Pakistan. And you also commented on that, and your a tweet went viral, and that probably triggered this discussion also. So, how do you interpret this kind of academic positioning, and what might be the larger, geopolitical motive behind defending Pakistan's performance in conflicts with India, especially when we know that almost 80% of the arsenal which Pakistan now has is the Chinese arsenal. So, how do you look at this Christopher Clary's article, Sibal's strong rebuttal, your rebuttal on this thing? And if you could comment on this.
Sure, very interesting question, and I think a very pertinent one given the times that we are living in. Now, facts can be interpreted and presented in ways to fit a narrative. And this is precisely why one is taught courses on ethics and data interpretation. Objectivity is supposedly the hallmark of all sorts of research. At least that's the case in the universities I've been part of, all in India, of course. Now, here's the thing, why is there a constant harping on what India lost? Have you ever come across a question on what Pakistan has lost? Why is there a constant attempt to downplay India's achievements? This is like, after India wins a cricket match against Pakistan, India's victory is reduced to how many wickets it lost to downplay the success. Now, in cricket matches, there is live recall, but in wars, there's not. However, India has provided more than adequate evidence in the form of satellite imagery, constant media engagement, and so on. Pakistan's own leadership, in their usual slips of tongues, hallmarks of lack of education, they've stated how much they've lost. Yet, Pakistani handles, in their fit of delusion, keep adding narratives to show that they have won. They can only imagine all of these sorts of things given the explosion of social media. Now, there is a narrative that India lost the narrative war, and Pakistan has won the narrative war. Here's the question: who decides that who has won a narrative war? Is there an agency that decides? What are the parameters for winning or losing narratives? Are narrative wars even defined? Is there a universally accepted definition of narrative wars? Answers to all of these is no. The fact is, just like terrorism, in narrative wars, there is ambiguity. And this is why malicious states like Pakistan or China would engage in such narrative peddling. Now, the difference between these troll farms, these engagement farms from malicious actors versus supposedly credible fact checkers or academics from Western media and think tanks is that there should be no anonymity. Given that academics and media personnel are expected to be credible, given that they're not anonymous, there's an expectation of credibility. But the West has gone and abused this. Question is why? Here's the thing. A, The West can't get over its colonial superiority. A post colonial state like India, which without any help, while facing 2.5 fronts of war from Pakistan and China, as well as internally, it's managed to pull off economic growth in ways that China and the West could not imagine. For the West, several countries grew only because of colonization of others in the global south, or they had alliances while they claimed to be democracies. For China, it could pull off economic growth because there's no opposition, there's no concern for human rights. Now, India, while being a democracy and the world's largest one at that, is also the world's fastest growing major economy. It's done it on its own without seeking alliances. So, how would China or the West be able to digest this? So, the best way to pull India's growth down is to downplay its successes, to keep it engaged in managing its periphery. And there is where the utility of Pakistan comes in, a terror sponsoring state. Thus, you will see so called academics twisting facts, Chinese and Western so called think tanks trying to buy out Indian academics, use their voices to malign India, and so on. What does this achieve? This creates doubt and confusion in the minds of the domestic audience and less faith in the ruling government. The ruling government then, in turn, has to focus more on assuring its own citizenry. And that takes time, that takes money, that takes attention, all of which could otherwise be put into leveraging growth and development. That's the simple reason, which is why these sorts of narratives are constantly built against India.
So, you mentioned about how, and we've talked about, how the Western and the Chinese actors, so they engage with the intellectuals in India. So, there are credible concerns that both Western and Chinese actors are actively engaging with Indian intellectuals to promote anti-India narratives. And as you mentioned about the 2.5 front war, that India internally has also this challenge. So I think this is a part of this challenge. So how widespread is this phenomena, and how does it actually work? And are we talking about subtle ideological influence, or is there something more deliberate and transactional?
So I'll just talk about a bit about journalistic practices and bias, which come particularly from the West. See, journalistic practices, while ideally objective, they are influenced by access, by sources, and by editorial priorities, which contribute to perceived bias. Talking about access to sources, Pakistan's government and military, they've historically been adept at managing media narratives, providing selective access to journalists in shaping stories through official statements. Western journalists, especially those reliant on local fixers or government contacts, they end up amplifying Pakistan's perspective. Just going a bit back in history, during conflicts like the 2019 Balakot airstrike, Pakistan had a very quick media response, as we saw this time as well. So that is which gets picked up. Then there's limited ground reporting. Western media outlets often have limited resources for on the ground reporting in South Asia. That is a bit different when it comes to India, because India is the world's largest democracy. So we have a lot of Western media outlets as well. That same sort of access is not there in Pakistan. So this leads to reliance on wire services, local stringers, or official statements, which do not completely capture the complex realities. Pakistan's tightly controlled media environment can make it easier for its narrative to dominate over less accessible or verified accounts from conflict zones. But here's the duty which comes from journalists, particularly from a democratic step setup. One needs to do their own fact checks. One needs to understand this reality. Then there is sensationalism and framing. Stories which will fit a certain narrative, such as Pakistan as a victim of terrorism or a key player in regional stability. It resonates more with Western audiences, it aligns with editorial agendas. This leads to selective framing, which overlooks contradictions like military losses or internal government issues. And then there's the underdog narrative. Western outlets may consciously or unconsciously frame Pakistan as an underdog compared to India, which is a larger and increasingly assertive power, leading to sympathetic or less critical coverage. Now, when it comes to the West, how do they try and leverage the zero point 0.5 front of warfare which exists for India? Bipin Rawat had mentioned this. The fact is that they will very selectively reach out to credible journalists and give them a certain sort of topic, which will be framed in a certain way. They'll also offer certain remuneration. The assumption here is that given the fact that there's remuneration, the academy or the person should actually toe the line which the Western think tank or the Western portal actually gives them. So that's one thing, the usage of money. And this is exactly similar to what China does. There's a lot of offer of money. Given the fact that we are in the internet age, accessing someone's email is not very difficult. So, an offer of $100, $200. This has been a common thing when it comes to so called Western free media or so called Western think tanks, and that's been the case even with China. I've received quite a few of these in my LinkedIn, in my inboxes, and so on. So I understand that there is this issue, and this is not based on a data set which comprises only of one instance. There have been multiple instances, at least 40 to 50. So which makes me understand that if one individual gets these many from both the West and China, assume how many of us would be getting this. How can we track this? Again, given the anonymity, given the fact that we are the world's largest democracy, we can't be chasing after people, give out what's coming into your inbox, etc. It's a challenge. I don't think any country in the world has done this, but India per se, and I'm guessing there would be other countries of the global south as well, who all they also would be getting this sorts of narrative influence from certain countries in the west, certain countries in the east, China to be precise. There is this intense need to portray countries which either would align with China's interests or with the West's interests. Now, does that work really well for a country's own foreign policy goals or domestic goals? I don't think so. So, but the fact is that in democracies, there is an understanding that people have the right to freedom of speech and expression, which is why abusing this right to freedom of speech and expression, people would be coerced or very, very subtly placated to churn out certain narratives which don't actually fit the agenda of the particular country that they are from. I hope this sort of answers your question.
So, so when it comes to the Western actors as well as both the Chinese state, so they have we have seen they have a very robust culture of, let's accept this, think tanks. And so do you see basically this is a big gap which we need to fulfill, that there is still not, we have come up with a few think tanks, but ironically they are also being projected as the extension of the establishment, extension of the Indian government, even very prestigious think tanks also. So, because you have been working with a number of think tanks, and you have been working especially in Taiwan also, and apart from that in the US and West, and you interact with the academicians. So, how do we meet this challenge? The problem we understand is there basically, but how do we meet this challenge? Because in US you have Republican think tanks and Democrat think tanks. They are never seen as an extension of the government. They are being projected, whether it is Brookings or whether it is you know Stimson Center or Carnegie Endowment Foundation. So, and in China also they have a number of think tanks, and they are straightforward an extension of the government. But is it the budget issue? Is it the culture of think tank issue? Is it the absence of rigorous academic research? Is it the absence of a global perspective in Indian media and lack of investments, because news gathering is an very cost intensive operation. We don't have even no. I always say, no, we don't have even correspondents, Indian media's correspondents, even in our neighborhood. So, but we are paddling basically, though we might think that it's a pro-India narrative or the right narrative, but the copies which we are reading is whether it is something happening in China or Nepal or even Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Myanmar or Bhutan, it's an AP, AFP, Reuters. So these kind of things. How do you look at, how do we fill this gap?
Again, very important question. I'll start with the example of, say, China. Given the fact that India hosts the Central Tibetan Administration, unlike those most powerful countries in the West which claim to have care or concerns for human rights, they don't host the CTA. India does. India hosts the CTA. So how does China play this? Very regularly they would offer, visiting fellowships or opportunities for journalists to travel to Tibet or guided tours to Xinjiang. Now, with Tibet, there's
I
a
was
big
offered
concern.
one. I was offered one because I've
Yeah.
known Chinua very
So you
closely.
would understand,
Yeah.
I think you would be the best person. Like, this happens on a very regular sorts of basis. And it's not like the CTA also likes this per se, right? Now, given the fact that we are the world's largest democracy, we believe in media freedoms, we cannot control these visits, and China abuses them, right? So when most of these journalists end up going to Tibet, when they do come back, they churn out a lot of these stories, which is aimed at perception shaping within India, within a democracy, about how Tibet has done very well under the CPC, right? Of late, after China came up with this white paper calling Tibet as Xinjiang, the attempt is to wipe out the identity of Tibet as Tibet, replacing even the name of Tibet. Right? Xizang means Western treasure trove in Chinese. Now, for India or Indians, there is also a security concern to this. When our own journalists come back to India, they start using the term Xizang for referring to Tibet. The moment you refer to Tibet as Xizang, which means Western treasure trove, one is also normalizing the usage or the understanding that India's Arunachal Pradesh is Zangnan or southern Tibet. Because something which is to the south of the Western treasure trove, of course, has to be southern Tibet or southern treasure trove, right? So there's also a security concern. But how much do our media people, our journalists understand this? It's very important to understand that there has to be a payoff. Otherwise, why would China be sponsoring free trips, right? Since you mentioned the West, there are a lot of Tibetans living even in Western countries, and I had the opportunity to speak to some of them who live in the West, in the US per se. And I had once asked that, do Western journalists end up regularly using the term Xizang for Tibet? The answer was no. That sort of consciousness is somehow there. And US is far, far, far away from Asia, far away from Tibet, far away from India. So the question here is, why is it that our media personnel don't have that awareness? Because we are actually democratic. We don't force these sorts of values or thoughts. But that being said, maybe a strategic understanding needs to be given. Don't normalize Chinese occupation. Do not normalize China's attempts to use the term Southern Tibet for India's own sovereign territory. That's one thing. That's what the Chinese actually do. The West, again, abusing the fact that Indians can and do think the ways in which they want to. We have a very active civil society, would again churn out certain sorts of narratives or give certain topics and expect them to adhere to that. Or even ask them in completely unrelated topics to toe the line which they would give, right? And they would all do this in the garb of objectivity. But here's the thing, if there is objectivity, why not let the person decide for herself or himself what he or she wants to write? So, this is the problem of being a democracy and the world's largest one. How do we counter this? Think tanks, again, there we do have a lot of brilliant, excellent think tanks which try to take the India First strategy, which also try and outline what is India's way forward. But here's the thing, there will be, given the fact that again internet is next to free for India, for Indians, and there's ambiguity, there's anonymity, there'll be a constant attempt to malign these think tanks. So these sorts of things, terms like Godi media, terms like, subjective interpretation would actually come up. So when that happens, one starts self censoring. It's also a very tacit way of psychological manipulation. And when one self censors, one can't even say that, oh, I've been coerced into doing this, right? But the constant labeling of certain think tanks, of certain media portals as belonging to the government or towing the government line, even though they actually might not be doing it, might be actually putting out their own visions, is a very conscious effort. So, how do we do that? I think we just need to grow thick skins, not care that, using labels like, oh, you're Godi media, oh, you are, funded by XYZ. I think Indians, or the ones who actually have India first vision, should actually stop caring about it. But that being said, I think there should be more awareness creation of this at least.
Uh, Dr. Pathak, given the stakes, so now, what should be overall, our counter strategy should be, because in the last discussion also, I think we took up this issue that, and I spoke with David Vance also and Nina Slama. So a lot of international experts, so they see now a nexus of Pakistan, China, Turkey, and then the West is also there. So, but now there is a choice between, as you rightly mentioned, that we are a democracy, we are a flourishing democracy. So, if we have to have a counter strategy to this, so both in terms of retaining the media credibility and safeguarding the academic independence, while also promoting the right narrative. So, what is the way forward as we, go ahead? And I also want to specifically ask you, you write in a lot of media publications also, but you are a very senior person in academia also. So when you look at, academia especially in India, so how do you look at, in terms of this influence operations, like we've talked about media, especially young scholars, who are pursuing their PhD. So how do you look at how, if you could explain by your own experience, how sometimes, most of the time, unknowingly, these PhD scholars, these young scholars, because they need validation, they need some financial support also, so they fall into this trap of, probably, doing a chapter in a certain book, which gives them validation, which gives them some academic credentials, which will help in their professional journey, but simultaneously also becoming a part of a larger plot, which is to promote anti-India narrative. So how does this, how they are, have laid out that net to catch our young, basically, scholars?
Again, I'll divide the answer into two bits, one for China and one for the West. Um, you know, when academics, especially the younger ones, want to create a name, what one has to do, and this is a problem which is common for scholars of the global south, is that we need to have something called Scopus Index publications, right? Now, most of the journals which are Scopus indexed come from the West. There are a couple of them, even from China. Now, if you want your own publication to be part of a Scopus Index journal, you'll have to end up consciously or unconsciously using citations which are from Western scholars or from Chinese scholars, right? How many Scopus Index journals do Indian organizations really have? Right? We have a few, but very few. Again, can be counted on fingers. Secondly, they're not very regular. So, how does the India voice go forward in terms of academics? We need to have Scopus Index journals, which are ours. China has also done that, right? So when you end up using citations from the West, you are ending up, so it's a form of neo-colonization in academics also. Take their way forward, take their developmental view forward, take their worldview forward, because you're using their citations. If you do not, then, well, you will not actually get a Scopus Index publication. That's a huge challenge. So I think India or Indian think tanks, Indian universities need to have a greater number of Scopus Index journals so that it's easier for our youngsters, young academics, to actually publish in what they think is objectively the way forward for India. That's one thing. Second, in terms of China's influence, there's this excellent resource, and it's online, it's open source. It's like Taiwan's Double Think Lab. It's called China Index. So every year they come up with indicators on how China influences various countries of the world. So the latest report has also been published. I think India is at somewhere in the 90s out of a long list of countries. At number one, which country is there? Well, no awards for guessing. It's Pakistan. How do they come up? What's the methodology? I would suggest it's a very great methodology because they have like 11 indicators ranging from academics to media to technology to diplomacy to military and so on, right? And there are very pinpointed questions, and one has to give evidence which is from the open source. And then they have their own weighted measures as to how they calculate, and all of it is available online. So if you look at how how does China spread its influence in India? In terms of domestic policies, the influence is negligible. In terms of technology, again, negligible. In terms of economy, well, a bit is there, but again, compared to Western countries, again, negligible. How does China spread its influence in India? Through media and academics. Given the fact that we believe in the freedom of the press, there will be repetitive of these attempts, of which you also mentioned as to how they had invited you as well. Fortunately or unfortunately, I also have received some of these invitations as a young think tanker when I was almost about 10 years ago. So they would try and push their influence through media, through academics. In terms of other sorts of things, maybe through culture, we made it very difficult for Confucius centers to exist in India, through the FCRA and so on. But through media, through academics, it's very easy to spread the influence. So that's a major challenge. Again, if we do something to protect us, there'll be a hectoring from the West, which will start talking about backsliding of democracy, even though it's to protect India's own sovereignty. So that's another challenge which we need to think of and how to deal with. And I think India needs to, at the civil society level, through Track 1.5 dialogues, continues to push forward the security concerns that we have vis-a-vis malicious actors, and as to how we shield ourselves. Just to give you an example, when we did ban TikTok because it's a malicious app, there were a lot of these cries from the West in particular. Oh, this is curtailment of democratic rights and democratic freedoms and democratic expressions. In 2 years, they ended up doing the same. So India actually took a lead. But I think what we could have done is written more about it, talked more about it as to how it's a security challenge for us and it's a sovereignty related issue for us. And on that, India doesn't take hectoring at all. So if we can have some of these things, I think it'll be a great move.
So we'll come to an end in our conversation. Though it's I would say it's a pause because this is a longer conversation which will continue to have with Dr. Pathak. And if you have any questions for Dr. Pathak, please share it in the description box of in the YouTube comment box, and we'll also be sharing that link of that how China influences the Taiwanese think tank's report. So we'll try and share a link of that in the description box so that readers can viewers can read it. Those who want to know more about it, and it's a China's influence operations is a fascinating subject because they have now this influence operation is also there in Hollywood. They have invested in indirectly through their companies in a lot of Western media outlets, and we would also like to map in our future conversation with Dr. Pathak that how they have captured the academic institutions in the West also to investing, and especially Dr. Pathak, I want to have a separate conversation, detailed conversation on the Confucius centers.
Right. No,
So
no, we'll definitely. It's because again, it's a very interesting thing, and I think despite how chaotic we are, because we are unity and diversity. The fact is, we identified Confucius centers as a big challenge early on, and that is something which Western countries could not do, which is why they are where they are. So yeah, I would love to have a discussion with you at some point in future on this as well.
yeah, so thank you, Dr. Pathak. And if you have liked this conversation, then please press the like button and share it and subscribe to our channel. We'll be back soon with another conversation. And Dr. Pathak, once again, thank you so much for taking time out from your busy schedule. As always, it has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Arunji.